Hello, hello. So excited to introduce a friend of mine, Stephen Garber, Dr. Stephen Garber. Many of you already know who he is, but I met Steve, although I've heard his name for years. I met him when he was teaching at Regent College, and I was a visiting scholar there. Um, Steve is the Senior Fellow for Vocation and the Common Good for the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust. And his most recent book is The Seamless Life, A Tapestry of Love and Learning, Worship and Work. And many people probably know of this book, Visions of Vocation, which I highly recommend. But anyway, I'm just glad to get a few minutes to chat with Steve. Thank you for joining me, Steve.
It's so good to see you, and even in this funny way, via Zoom, Mary McCampbell. So I have a question to start off with, Mary, for
Yes,
you.
great.
I know when you first came from, Tennessee to Vancouver, British Columbia, and you were going to be stepping into this role of visiting scholar, but one of the things which fascinated me was that here you were from, I think it was, Memphis, Tennessee, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then Cleveland, Tennessee, and then somehow along the way you'd become remarkably interested in the writings of the Vancouver novelist Douglas Copeland, and more than just like I read a book or two, or more than even I gave a lecture on him, but like you had spent years thinking about who he is and what he was doing and why he was writing the books he was writing. And you actually had entrepreneurially, with sort of remarkable grace, had persisted and persevered and found your way into some honest conversations with him. And um, tell me why that all was so interesting to you, why he became so much of somebody that you wanted to understand, and you wanted, in fact, in the book you've written so wonderfully well, you've written about him with surprise, not surprising to me now, but I would say maybe to most readers, surprising insight.
Oh, thank you for that incredible compliment, Steve. That really means a lot, especially coming from you. And I'm just laughing, thinking, some people would say that I just kind of kept poking and bothering Douglas Copeland until he talked to me. But you said it so nicely. When I first started, so I wanted to do a PhD, my doctoral dissertation on contemporary literature, and how contemporary literature, not from Christian authors, we're not Wendell Berry or Marilyn Robinson, but contemporary literature from authors that maybe aren't on lots of Christian readers' radars. The fact that I had encountered so many biblical references and serious theological questions within those. I'd taken a class in graduate school reading a lot of particularly post-colonial authors, and Copeland was someone that I had read just for fun. He was a fun author, and he was all zeitgeisty and all that and funny, but it turned out that, and I wasn't even suggesting him for the PhD. I was doing Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, Don DeLillo, some others, and my dissertation supervisor suggested him because he was an editor for a theology and literature journal, the Oxford Journal, and said there'd just been a wonderful essay by Douglas Copeland from Andrew Tate, who is now a good friend and who was the external examiner for my dissertation. So there's a lot of history there. But anyway, that's a lot of backstory. But the point is, he said, you really should look at Copeland. And I think there'd be a lot of, theological depth there that maybe you've kind of missed just skimming, just fun reading. And he was exactly right. And Copeland, it was supposed to originally be, a dissertation looking at many different authors. And there were other authors, but they were all centered around Copeland. Like, he kind of took over. But you're asking why did he take over? I was really fascinated, always have been, with common grace insights, and with reading and looking at art from those who are not Christians, but who are very much focused on a desire for God, wanting, seeking God. And Copeland's very overt about that, especially in his book of short stories, Life After God. He talks a lot about growing up secular in Vancouver, which is a very, quote, secular city. You live there.
Very proudly secular city.
Profoundly. I mean, yes. I mean, it feels more European in that sense, but that Copeland kind of, especially in Life After God, he laments the lack of an overarching narrative in his life, that they wasn't taught something, wasn't passed down. And so his books are very much about, they're postmodern, but they're also very unfashionable among many postmodern circles, in the sense that he talks about searching for truth. And there is a yes, I mean, he talks about why do we have religious impulses if God is dead? And that's kind of underlying in his books. And I just feel like there's a real heart at the center of his work. There's a real tenderness and a real vulnerability. And I just loved that. And then when I met him as a person, he was that way as well. So that's some of it. I mean, he's just a brilliant author in general, but I think the theological discussion and the heart longing that comes out in his work has really captured my imagination and helped me to be empathetic.
Yes.
He is one person that has really helped me to think differently about other people. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Wasn't more of many things with you, Mary, but when I read your work, I was so pleased to see how beautifully you had written it, and with such wide-ranging interests. And I think I wrote something about this in the endorsement of just sort of surprising depth and breadth of the best films, the best stories that you have skillfully woven into the tapestry of your own book, really. But just one more thing about Copeland and about you, because I also use this image in the endorsement that you have drawn us to look over your shoulder and through your heart at the way you see the world, which to me is profound and important, to see yourself as a professor that way. In some ways, you open up your classroom to us as the reader to say, well, if you were my student, you'd come in, you would take part in discussions about these things with me. So you've drawn us in to learn from you in that way, this image of over the shoulder through the heart. But knowing a little bit about you, and I think about, the little bit I know about Memphis in your life, and a little bit about Chattanooga and your undergraduate studies there. But then you also, you've talked with me a lot about the L'Abri experience in your life. And thinking about, what L'Abri has meant for, a couple generations of people now in the world. When you think about, what you went into and came out of, and still continue to deepen affections and relationships to the L'Abri world, what of that world that gave you maybe maturity, interest, ability of heart and mind to engage somebody who was in some ways outside the box as Copeland?
Yeah, and of course, I've spent a lot of time in English L'Abri, and they are big fans of Copeland. We even did a reading group once with Life After God that I helped lead with Jim Paul, who's now the director there. And they have a love of Copeland. But I think L'Abri, I think just the way they. I mean, I've heard wonderful lectures at L'Abri on Damien Hirst, the artist. I've heard a wonderful lecture on the book, the movie The Exorcist, and I'm just thinking of all the things that you typically wouldn't think you would hear at sort of a Christian study center. And I feel like at L'Abri, we are asked to really look for what is true and what is good and what is right here. I mean, that doesn't mean they're not discerning. Of course, you're discerning and asking what is true, what is leading towards life, and what is false, what is leading towards death. But I really like the way that there's such an openness there. I feel like the L'Abri community, there's not a sense of being grounded in fear, which sometimes you do encounter in more general Christian, evangelical circles, especially in America, that, oh, this item of culture, this non-Christian thing, we got to be afraid of that. There was just such an openness and generosity, and such a kind of teaching us to read and listen charitably, teaching us to really really listen and to really focus on seeing the image of God in other human beings. And I quote from Ellis Potter, one of his lectures. Ellis Potter is someone with a long relationship with Labrie, about how art is not a commodity. It's a relation. It's not an act of consumption. It's a relationship.
Hmm.
And that's really put into practice at Labrie. And
Yeah.
there's also, Labrie also makes space for honest questions, and really, just as Francis Schaeffer, treating everyone, there's no little people, everyone's important. So I don't know, after spending time at Labrie, I remember one time going to into London and sitting on the tube and just looking around, and I was just kind of brought to tears and overwhelmed by the glorious beauty of all of these people around me, and that they each had an universe inside of them. And that the Labrie teaching and thinking helped me to kind of slow down and recognize that. So much that it was almost too much, it was just like overwhelming. So, but yeah, Labrie has played a big part in my thinking, and it's a big part in this book. So, and I know it's very important for you as well. So thank you for asking that. Well, I have a question for you.
Okay.
And because of so much work that you've done on vocation, and I want to ask you just to comment on the importance of developing our capacity for empathy as we try to discern what our vocation is. Mm-hmm. Of course, you might even want to explain what vocation is according to your terms and usage, in case people aren't familiar with that. But how does our capacity for empathy really relate to our vocation? How should it relate to our vocation?
It's such a good question, Mary. We have so little time, but let's try to say something here that is meaningful. The words vocation and calling are the very same words. Mm-hmm. One is Greek, one is Latin, but they're the same meaning. And calling, vocation, we speak about vocal cords, which is a little hint to us actually where this word comes from. Vox or vocare is somebody saying something, somebody speaking. Vocal cords are all about that, of course. So vocation is the assumption that someone has said something and that actually that we can hear. So the word calling is not hard to understand in that sense. Because we have limited time, I'll just step right into this. I mean, again, you mentioned Labrie a little bit. One of the best books that came out of the Labrie history was Schaeffer's own book, He Is There and He's Not Silent. Mm-hmm. And of course, the assumption was not only is there a God in the universe, who can be known, but he can be known because he's not been silent. We can know something about who he is and who we're to be, actually. That's the heart of that argument of the book. It's not a silent universe in that sense. So vocation as a word, as an idea, takes its place within that larger conversation about the world we live in, who is God and who are we, and whether in fact God said anything that actually we can understand. One of my own great teachers was the Czech playwright, politician Václav Havel, who said very tellingly and very profoundly, the secret of man is the secret of his responsibility. The heart of our humanity is our ability to respond, our responsibility. It's very Augustinian insight, actually, profoundly Augustinian insight. But think about the word responsibility in relationship to what I've said about vocation and calling, and you realize that our ability to respond to what has been said is at the heart of our own humanity. Mm-hmm. So vocation is a big idea. It's a big word because it has to cover the waterfront of our souls, actually, of all of who we are. Just to kind of zero in on the particulars of your question here, I would say that, made the very image of God as we are, you use that image in relationship to what you learned at Labrie. But if God is a particular kind of a God who at the heart of his own revelation to us, he knows the world and he chooses to love the world. Mm-hmm. You can say 1,000 things about who God is, but in my mind, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Hebrew and Christian faith, is the God who not only knows the world, but he chooses to love the world. That's the deep, deep, insight of Old Testament faith, of Hebrew faith. It clearly is summarized, so beautifully and so well known to most of us in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. For God, the assumption is God knew the world, and he chose to love the world.
Hmm.
Um, that's profound,
Very
really.
profound.
Profound, really, because we know we all struggle all day long with, but I want to be known, but if you know me, then you won't like me.
Yes.
What am I
Yes.
going to do with that, really? If you really knew me, and of course, going back to Father Adam and Mother Eve, the very first response to life in the world after the fall was to cover themselves up in shame. I don't want to be known anymore, really. So that's deep, 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 deep within us, I would say.
Yes.
So if God is like that, he knows and he loves, I would say it's meaningful to use the language that is actually the vocation of God himself.
Hmm.
And I would argue that, in fact, that is the human vocation too, then, in the image of God. We are to know and to love. Now, I'm just going to push right into a good word, Mary McCampbell. The word empathy, of course, empathy,
Yes.
is all about that, actually. And again, good words have good histories, but if you use the word empathy in the dominant world and worldview of the centuries around the coming of Jesus was Stoicism. The great Abraham Heschel, the great Hebrew scholar of the last century, argued that actually the prophets were writing into a Stoic world. In the heart of Stoicism, their chief virtue was what they called apatheia. It isn't a word we actually have we don't have no word like that today, other than a word that's a little bit like it, apathy. But
Mm-hmm.
apatheia was actually to know and to not care.
Mm-hmm.
To know and actually to say, well, I know about that, but so what, basically. I know about that, but I'm not going to get hurt again in my life. I know about that, but I'm not going to get interested, because you know what? If I get interested, yeah, I'll get hurt. I
Mm.
won't, I won't go there. I won't go there. I will not go there, really. The God of the prophets was the God who was not that God. He knew and he loved. He knew and he cared. He knew and he required. He knew and he said, be like this, be like me in the world. How can you say you're my people if you don't be like me in the world? Was the
Mm.
lament of the prophets, actually. So here we have in Jesus, God in the flesh, the word made flesh, who says, I know you. That beautiful, beautiful story in the chapter after John 3:16, chapter 4, is the woman at the Samaritan well who can't believe that here she's been known by all these men, not loved by any of them. And then here's this man who says, I know you. And yes, she runs back to her village and says, the most amazing thing has happened. This man knows me and he loves me.
Mm.
And that just revolutionizes her. It transforms her, actually. So you're good. You've developed this with sophistication and insight and maturity and surprising, skillfulness, Mary. But the whole book is about, how do we understand, art in general, artfulness as a way of thinking about the world, the stories of in film and in novels, as a way to lead us into the deepening of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Which of course is in some ways the contrast to apathy, or to some version of apatheia, because it's actually to see ourselves drawn into in that way. So I would say that that really is, in my mind, you could say 1,000 things about what vocation is and isn't, but in my mind, to know and to love the world in and through the vocations that God gives to us is the heart of what it means to be made in the image of God.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. That was amazingly concise and full at the same time, and very beautiful. So thank you for that. There's a lot to chew on. And it's very, very helpful. And Steve, I just have one more question for you, and then we'll wrap it up. But I'd just like to know, what is one work of art? It can be any art in any form. It can be literature, film, painting, that has helped you to become a more empathetic person.
I hate one, like, questions like one thing, your favorite thing.
Well, this is one out of many. We will know. We will know. Maybe you can provide a list later, but
So, I mean, I could tell you, we could talk about this for hours, Mary.
I know.
I can draw upon some of the things you've written about so well. For example, like the Terrence Malick movies are quite fascinating to me for all kinds of important reasons. But
Yes.
I'll just choose one that I've been deeply into the over the weeks of Lent, which we're just coming from as of yesterday with Easter. But every year for years, I've chosen to read the first 125 pages of Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables.
Hmm.
And it's been a Lenten discipline for me for many years now. I have loved the musical, loved it, just majestic, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, really. But you get 5 minutes of the bishop's life on stage.
Hmm.
In Hugo's novel, they're the first 125 pages of the whole shebang, the whole novel, actually. And they called it A Just Man. And so you really have him all the way through the course of his life, those 100+ pages, actually. And I would say because Lent is a time of wanting to be probed. That's what I think the weeks are about, wanting to think about ourselves all over again.
Hmm.
And, to bring the good, good work of John Calvin into to this French Catholic that Hugo sort of was. But the first pages of the Institutes are a true knowledge of God, a true knowledge of self, inextricably bound up with each other. Actually, you can't know one without the other. So what is this first part of Les Miserables? Of course, it's important to say, not just playfully or offhandedly, Les Mis, as if somehow that captures this. This is the story about the miserables.
Yeah.
Just to say it out loud. And the bishop is called A Just Man. That's what this first 100+ pages are about. And it's remarkable, Mary, just that to see him be somebody who grows into a certain kind of a life. You've asked about the developing of empathy in some kind of work of art. Well, remember that surprising moment in even on stage, the version of the story, where the two women, his sister and the housekeeper, are concerned about the noise, the word there's a man out in the streets of this village. We must keep the door locked tonight. Bishop says out loud to both of them, we hear it, and it's words for the centuries and the ages. He says, if we lock the door, then the person who needs to get in can't get in. Someone may probably need to get in tonight. And they're shocked with these words, of course. But the 100 pages behind that in this novel by Hugo explain why the bishop is that kind of a person. It's so much like that deep insight of Iris Murdoch, the Oxford moral philosopher. At crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. And so here's the bishop as somebody who has lived his whole life towards that moment with his housekeeper and his sister, who are concerned about the news of somebody who's out in the streets. Turns out to be Jean Valjean, of course. But the bishop's own heart, the habits of heart he's formed over the years of his life, make him be somebody who says, well, then he won't be able to get in if we lock the door tonight. And I read it because I want to be nourished. I want to be stirred. I want to be disquieted. I want to be probed. So every year when I read it, I find myself thinking, God in heaven, make me be more and more and more like that kind of a man.
Yes. And I'm just, thank you for that. And I'm just thinking about how, with this example of the bishop and the reaction from the women, and then with the example of the Stoics and the idea of apathy, how often empathy is something that is truly countercultural. And although we see it talked about a lot, and we see maybe sometimes it is even trendy to kind of, there's a sense that if you're in agreement with everything, then you're empathetic and loving, which that's not really what empathy is. Empathy is about really going from the core of one person to the core of to your core, seeing, I think, as Christian empathy, the image of God in them. And that can be, I don't know, that's just a life-changing process. And true empathy, I think, is still countercultural, because we tend to go in these little pockets where the people that we agree with or look like are the ones that we empathize with. So, so that's a wonderful example. And it makes me think of, that quote makes me think of, it's a quote I use in the book from MLK. And I feel like I've done these podcasts and I feel like I keep quoting this, but I'll do it again. Is when MLK says about the Good Samaritan story, that the religious people that walked by and ignored the man in need were thinking, what will happen to me if I go over and help him? They were fearful Whereas
Right.
the real question that we should ask, if we're going to be, Christ followers, if we're going to be empathetic, is what will happen to him if I don't go over there? And so that to me sounds a lot like the bishop's
Right.
response.
Right.
So, well, thank you so much, Steve. This is, as always, has been wonderful, fascinating, and just lovely. And I encourage people, check out Steve's books and his writing and the many things he does. And anyway, just want to say goodbye and thank you very much.
It's a gift to be part of the friendship world that is yours. So thank you for being that to me.
Thank you.
Showing this book may go far.